As dawn broke on August 6, 1915, the air thickened with tension as a sinister green cloud crept ominously across the landscape. What followed was a scene straight out of a horror movie that would haunt the nightmares of those who witnessed it. The toxic gas had been drifting over the old Russian imperial fortress of Osijek in what is now northeastern Poland. The fortress was in the middle of difficult-to-pass swampland, a passageway from Germany into deeper Russia. With the outbreak of hostilities, the Germans and the Russians fought bitterly, inflicting devastating casualties in a series of offensives and counteroffensives. In September 1914, the Germans launched their first attack against Osijek, sending 40 battalions of the 8th Army to overwhelm the fortress. In spite of being greatly outnumbered, the Russians managed to throw back the initial assault, counterattacking the Germans with 2 flanking maneuvers, which forced them to withdraw. The Germans would try again in February of 1915, this time wheeling up heavy artillery pieces to blast the obstinate fortress into dust. At least one of these pieces was a giant 420mm siege mortar, nicknamed Big Bertha, along with many other smaller pieces. The Germans rained shells on Osijek Fortress for months, dropping over 1 million shells, but the Russians still did not give in. In July of 1915, the German war effort in the east was taken over by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, hero of the crushing victory at the Battle of Tannenberg. With the new leadership came a new strategy to finally deal with the stubborn Russians in Osijek. Hindenburg brought up 14 battalions to overwhelm the fortress, along with 30 batteries of gas artillery, 30 large siege guns, a sapper battalion, and specialist troops who were trained to breach fortifications. In total, around 7,000 German soldiers were sent to eliminate the stubborn Russian defenders. Facing this force was a garrison made up of the 226th Zemlyansk Regiment, as well as some units of militia, around 900 men in total. For weeks, the fortress was bombarded relentlessly, the Germans shooting thousands of artillery rounds, but the Russians again refused to surrender, and the attackers were growing increasingly frustrated with their lack of progress. In early August, German leadership authorized the use of the most infamous weaponry of the First World War. In addition to the regular high-explosive artillery shells, the Germans also had access to a large quantity of chlorine and bromine gas, and waited for an opportunity to use it. Chlorine gas is a devastating chemical agent that was first used as a weapon at Ypres in April 1915 against the British. It's a pale green-yellow gas that is much heavier than air, which means that a cloud will hover at ground level rather than dissipate into the atmosphere. When it comes into contact with moisture, such as in the eyes, mouth, or lungs, it turns into hydrochloric acid, a corrosive chemical that damages the surrounding tissue and can lead to death if inhaled in sufficient quantities. Lower doses can lead to eye irritation, respiratory distress, and vomiting. One of the major flaws of chlorine gas as a weapon is that it's easy to spot, being a pale green cloud, and has a distinctive odor, described as a combination of pineapple and pepper. This gave those under a gas attack an opportunity to take countermeasures, such as moving to higher ground or donning their gas masks. On August 6, 1915, at around 4 a.m., the wind and weather conditions were right, and the Germans launched their attack, firing a barrage of conventional artillery shells while also deploying the deadly gas from 30 batteries. The effects were apparent even before the gas reached the Russian lines. As the sickly pale green cloud inexorably crept forward at ground level, grass turned black and leaves in trees instantly turned yellow as the contained moisture turned into hydrochloric acid. Birds and insects fell to the ground dead as the cloud moved on. Copper plating on guns and shells were corroded on contact, turning to chlorine oxide. When the cloud reached the Russian lines, the men inhaled the deadly toxin. The Russians had a few gas masks which were in poor condition, and not enough for all the men, so were forced to use rags covered in water or urine tied around their noses and mouths to protect against the poison. Chlorine gas is water-soluble, so this can mitigate some of the toxicity before it enters the lungs or mouth, but this is obviously far from ideal. The gas reacted on contact with moist surfaces, the hydrochloric acid dissolving tissue in the eyes, mouth, and lungs. Russian soldiers began coughing uncontrollably as their respiratory system was being eaten alive. Many coughed up blood. Scores died during the onslaught, and after months of effort, the way into Osijek was clear. Capitalizing on the Russians' confusion, the Germans formed up and, wearing gas masks, 14 battalions began their assault on the fortress, their artillery guns stopping to avoid hitting their own men. As they made their way across no man's land, the discolored and silent landscape bore testimony to the destructive power of the chlorine. They were expecting little, if any, resistance from the Russians, who bore the brunt of the noxious cloud. They were mistaken. As they approached, the German soldiers, expecting an easy victory, were faced with a horrifying sight. Instead of dead enemies, inexplicably, the Russians were launching a bayonet attack. In spite of the tremendous toll the gas had taken, some of the Russian soldiers were still alive. Sub-Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinsky was the highest-ranking survivor and organized the remaining Russian defenders for a counterattack. The surviving members of the 8th and 13th Company formed up and were charging towards the advancing Germans. There were only around 100 who managed to countercharge, not nearly enough to repel the attackers. Their attack was not only physical, but also psychological. In what must have looked like a nightmare made real, the Russian soldiers must have looked like a horde of the undead, stumbling and shambling forwards, clutching corroded weapons, blood leaking from irritated eyes, fresh blood staining their uniforms as they closed the distance with the Germans. From the German perspective, it seemed as if the dead had returned to life to oppose them, and rather than finishing off vulnerable soldiers, were facing a horde of newly risen zombies. Seeing this horrific sight of the dead now charging towards them, panic gripped the Germans, whose attack stalled out in the face of the onslaught. Terror gripped the men, and many turned and ran in fear, heedless of everything except getting away. In some cases, they were so frightened that they became caught in their own barbed wire defenses. Some of the surviving Russians in the fort managed to fire the 5 remaining artillery pieces, further adding to the confusion. The once confident advance became a rout, and the attack on Osijek once again ended in failure. In spite of their heroics, the garrison was in terrible shape, with the vast majority of the 900 men killed, wounded, or incapacitated by the gas attack. Many who participated in the attack of the dead men, as newspapers would later call it, succumbed to their injuries. 2 weeks after the attack, the fortress, which had been a thorn in the side of the Germans, was abandoned. Though it never fell to the enemy directly, German successes on other sections of the front threatened to surround and cut off Osijek. The Germans would occupy the location until 1919, not seeing any further fighting. It would transfer to Polish authority and then be controlled by the Red Army during World War II until overrun by the Wehrmacht. After the war, control was again transferred to the Polish military. Today, some parts of the fortress are still under control of the Polish military, though a portion of the site is open to tourists, a monument to one of the stranger and more horrific events in a war known for its devastation and carnage.